Okay, gas exchange time. So we are going to talk about what influences gas exchange, what we mean by partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide, gas solubility, and circulation. So let's start off with what is gas exchange? Well, hopefully by this point, you know that it is exchange of gases, particularly oxygen and carbon dioxide, between the air and blood. Where does it occur? The alveoli. How does the oxygen diffuse? In simple terms, concentration gradients. And what do you need for successful gas exchange? You need a large surface area and a moist membrane. I really hope that before you started this lecture, you watched the YouTube video on gas exchange. If you haven't, go back and watch that and then come here and pick up where we've left off. The animations that they do with the YouTube videos is just more than I can technologically handle at the moment. So I think visually, it's always good to see what's going on. And then when we discuss it during lecture, hopefully it will make a little bit more sense. So diffusion in the lungs, we've talked about diffusion testing measurements. So this is the spirometry and how well our lungs exchange gases. And this is important because the major function of the lungs is to allow oxygen to diffuse or pass into the blood and allow carbon dioxide to diffuse from the blood back to the lungs. And we're going to draw some visuals and really show this in this lecture. So let's draw a simplified picture of gas exchange. So this will look a little bit not as good as the YouTube video that you watched, but I think it's always good to draw this out to really understand what's going on. So let's draw kind of our alveoli here. So this is our alveoli. And we'll kind of draw our arteries and veins, the blood, if you will. Let's start with blue, and let's start with deoxygenated blood. So we are going to have blood go in. Then when we get down here, we are going to get to purple, which is our capillary network. So we know that these are tiny blood vessels that facilitate gas exchange. So now this is oxygenated blood. So our gas exchange has occurred. Now, let's talk about exercise really quickly. And we know that the need, let's say, as the need for oxygen increases and you have more carbon dioxide produced because of exercise, you are going to have more frequent gas exchange between your lungs and your blood. So this is a very simplified picture of gas exchange. The YouTube video did a much better job of showing the animation. So hopefully between that and then drawing this out, you have an understanding of what we're talking about with gas exchange. So the basic principles of gas exchange during respiration, we know this primarily occurs during diffusion. So diffusion is this process in which transport is driven by concentration gradients. So we know that gas molecules move from a region of high concentration to low concentration. So blood that is low in oxygen concentration and high in carbon dioxide concentration must undergo gas exchange. So the air in the lungs has a higher concentration of oxygen than that of the oxygen depleted blood and a lower concentration of carbon dioxide. So this concentration gradient is really what's going to allow for gas exchange during our respiration. So it's important that we also talk about partial pressures, and we mean this as a measurement of the concentration of the individual components of a mixture of gases. So the total pressure exerted by a mixture is the sum of the partial pressure components within a mixture. So the rate of diffusion of a gas is proportional to its partial pressure within the total gas mixture. And so in continuing to talk about what alveolar gas exchange is influenced by, we have sort of this nice diagram and chart. So I'm going to zoom in to the left-hand side of the chart here. And the first I can't speak. The first thing that gas exchange is going to be influenced by is our oxygen can actually reach the alveoli. And we know that this is impacted by several factors. So we will talk in the next lecture about altitude, humidity, cold, and smoking or smoke in the air as well. And so what influences this is the composition of inspired air, as well as your ability to ventilate. Ventilation is further influenced by three components. The first is the rate and depth of breathing. Again, the spirometry measurements. Airway resistance. Do you have emphysema? Do you have COVID? Do you have COPD? And lung compliance. So what we're talking about, that is sort of the flexibility of your lungs. So maybe, do you have fibrosis? That will certainly decrease lung compliance, which will then impact your ability to ventilate, which will then impact how much oxygen can reach the alveoli, which will then influence how successful gas exchange is. So here in the middle, The second component that I want to talk about, and this will be another lecture, I've got an awesome video to go along with this, is called Fick's Law of Diffusion. And so what we have here is gas exchange between the alveoli and the blood. And so Fick's law of diffusion is really going to depend on having a large surface area as well as this diffusion distance. And this diffusion distance will further be impacted by barrier thickness and the amount of fluid present. Again, we're really going to talk about Fick's law of diffusion in the coming modules. The last one that we'll discuss here on the right-hand side is the perfusion of our alveoli. And remember, that is our VQ ratio. So the amount of air reaching the lungs versus the amount of blood reaching the lungs. So we know for rest and light exercise, a normal VQ ratio is 0.8 to 0.9 liters. And heavy exercise, our VQ ratio can get up to 5 liters per minute. So this is just a nice little kind of graph. I guess it's not really a graph. Visual to show us what alveolar gas exchange is influenced by. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about these different laws, but I thought it's important to at least mention, and we've touched on this a little bit, that we measure gases in a partial pressure. And so molecules of each specific gas in a mixture exert their individual partial pressures. And when I show the Fick's law of diffusion video, hopefully visually we'll be able to make some more sense of this. So we know that if we have nitrogen, our oxygen, and our carbon dioxide, the total partial pressure of atmospheric gases is 760 millimeters per mercury. The partial pressure of oxygen at sea level is 160 millimeters of mercury. We know that this will decrease at higher altitudes. And in this example, we have 110 millimeters of mercury. And we'll talk more about this in our altitude lecture. So for gas solubility, we know that for our alveoli, more carbon dioxide and water vapor and less percent of oxygen means that oxygen moves into the blood, into the alveoli, and these mixture of the new gases in the conducting tubes is what helps with gas exchange. So differences in the partial pressure of these gases allow for gas exchange via diffusion. So we're not going to have time to go into a lot of detail with this, but I at least want you to be familiar with the terms of the partial pressure, the gas solubility, and what we're talking about in terms of gas exchange. So in keeping with our theme of circulation and gas exchange, here on the left, it says to recall the interconnection between circulation and the respiratory system. So we've already set that stage, the cardiorespiratory system. So we know that gas exchange at the lungs and in the body cells move oxygen into cells and carbon dioxide out. And so what we have here on the right is a schematic showing oxygenated blood and our deoxygenated blood. So remember how I drew our alveoli and then our blood, and we have this diffusion distance. Remember, we had our deoxygenated blood, we had our capillaries, and then we had our oxygenated blood. This is another way to show that. So to start, we are going to have gases move in and out by breathing. Then oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged via diffusion. So gases are now dissolved in the blood and transported by the circulatory system. So then, I should probably say 4. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged at the tissue level. And this is our aerobic metabolism. So remembering back to that second unit here, where we have our metabolism, our aerobic metabolism underway. So this again is just another example and visual in discussing circulation and gas exchange. So what I would love to do before I get there, let me add just a blank page. Can I do that on the fly? Well, interesting. I guess I'll do that in our next module. What I want to do is sort of draw this out in a different way, again, to help us sort of understand what's going on. You know what? I do have a blank page. Okay, so bear with me here. We're going to say breathe in air, oxygen, breathing in oxygen. This oxygen is going to reach the alveoli and the lungs. So we have oxygenated blood, which is our arterial blood. This is going to combine with hemoglobin. And then at the tissue level, this is where we have our metabolism and our generation of ATP. Now our blood is deoxygenated. So this will be our venous blood, where carbon dioxide, excuse me, is then released, and this cycle will start all over again. So let's go ahead and fill in one more thing for this lecture. And I want to start, this is again, just giving you another avenue and another visual to understand what is going on here. So let's start here with our inspired air. And we know that at sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is 160 millimeters of mercury. We have trace amounts of carbon dioxide in the air. So this graph right here is actually showing that. Quite a bit of oxygen, trace amounts of carbon dioxide. So as we bring in this atmospheric air at sea level for this example, we then go to number 2 for our gas exchange. So our alveoli of the lungs, where our partial pressure of oxygen is 104 millimeters of mercury, whereas our partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeters of mercury. And again, you can see that sort of here depicted that we do have more, a greater partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli. And then what's going to happen next is we are going to directly communicate with the blood in the capillaries. And this will be a partial pressure oxygen of 100 millimeters of mercury, and carbon dioxide is going to stay around 40 millimeters of mercury. We then will go down to the tissue level, where the partial pressure of oxygen will be less than 40, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going to be greater than 45. So now we have that deoxygenated venous return, where we will have our expired air of 120 millimeters for our oxygen and about 32 millimeters of mercury for our carbon dioxide. So what I want to do is, again, number one, we are talking about ventilation. Number two, we are talking about exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the blood. Number three, we are transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lung and the tissues. Then after that, we are transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the tissues. So hopefully through these different examples, we have been able to convince you what influences this alveolar gas exchange, what we mean by partial pressures, an introduction with gas solubility, and then ending with our circulation and gas exchange. So look for some of the YouTube videos and some more explanation of all of this in our next module. Thanks.